In the last video in this Django and HTMX series, what we did was we added a form to allow users to create a financial transaction in this application. So what we had before was a table containing all of the transactions, and we added this icon here that when we click takes us to a form that allows us to add a new transaction into the application for the logged in user. What we're going to do in this video is add some error handling to the form, and we're also going to add some validation rules. For example, the amount field in this form, we want to prevent the user from submitting the form if they put in an amount that's less than 0. And the purpose of doing this in this video is to show how to work with errors in forms in Django and when we're using HTMX as well. And we'll also of course see how to do validation, and importantly we're going to write some tests using pytest for this functionality at the end of the video. Now before we jump in, I'm planning to release a course on Django REST framework, and I have this Ko-fi site. What I'm going to do is I've set a goal of $1,000. If we can make that goal on Ko-fi, I'm going to release that on YouTube. Otherwise, what I'm going to do is release the course on a platform like Udemy. Now, I would like to release this so that it's free for all on YouTube, but the time investment and the reward from YouTube is unfortunately not really worth it. So this Ko-fi goal here, if you want to see a Django REST framework series on YouTube, feel free to donate to the Ko-fi page. There's a link in the description. Let's now move on and get started with this video. So we have a form here that allows us to create a transaction. We're going to add some validation rules, and we're going to target this amount field, as I said a second ago. Now the way that we added this form was, if we go to VS Code, we defined a Django form class called transaction form, and that was inheriting from the model form that's built into Django, and it was tied to the application's transaction model. What we're going to do now is we're going to add a piece of custom validation for the amount field, and you can see in the meta class here, amount is one of the fields in the meta class. So now we're going to learn how to define a validation function for the amount field. So I'm going to go just above the meta class, and what I'm going to do here is define a function, and the convention in Django is to call the function clean underscore and then the name of the field. So the name of the field is amount, so the name of the function here for validation is going to be called clean amount. And because this is a method on the form class, it's going to have self as the first argument, and we're going to get the amount that's been submitted from the front end by the user. And to get that in a validation function, what we do is we access self.cleaned underscore data, and this is a Python dictionary containing all of the submitted data fields, and it's the amount field that we want to get from that dictionary. So that's going to give us the value submitted from the front end by the user when the post request is sent and this form is instantiated. What we can then do is add the validation check, and what I'm going to do is add a check here if the amount is less than or equal to 0. And less than or equal to, why are we using that? Well, if the transaction is equal to 0, there's no point in going to this form here and submitting that, because it's not going to affect any of the numbers. You can't really have a transaction with 0 amount. So what we're going to do in this case is we're going to raise a forms.validation error, and the validation error class is going to take a message, and I'm going to pass in here that the amount must be a positive number. So this conditional statement, checking if the amount is less than or equal to 0, this is the validation that we want to perform. We want to check that value, and if we don't get a validation error, we just want to return the amount that's been submitted by the user. So this is going to prevent users from submitting the form with values less than or equal to 0. So I'm going to save this file, and we're going to go back to the front end, and I'm going to try and add a transaction here, let's say with a value of -5, and we can add a date for this transaction, and I'm going to give it the category of close. So let's now click the add button here, and you can see we get back the same form template here. We have a duplicated header at the top, and we now have an instance of the form below that, and the form is now empty. So what's happened here? If we go to the terminal, what we're going to see is we have the post request being sent, and we're getting the 200 response. So even though we've added this validation, it doesn't seem like anything has happened here. We're getting back the same template, the same partial as we had originally. Let's go to the application's views.py file, and we're going to go to the the create transaction function here that we had for this particular functionality. Now the check here on line 37 is what's important. We're checking, is the form valid, using the form.isValid function. And if it's valid, we are adding the transaction to the database. But notice that we don't have an else block here. We're not handling the case where the form has validation errors. Instead, we're just going back to the block at the bottom of this, and that block instantiates a new transaction form that doesn't contain any data, and it returns that same partial to the user. So what we need to do in order to make this work with our validation constraints is add an else block. Now I'm going to set up a context dictionary in the else block, and we're going to add a key called form into that, and that's going to contain this transaction form that contains the posted data from the user. So basically we instantiate this transaction form with the data that the user has submitted. We're now going to add that to the context here, and that's because this form, because it has validation errors, the errors are going to be attached to the form fields. Once we've done that, we can return the same partial. So what I'm going to do is copy this render statement, and I'm going to paste that in here. So that's going to return the create transaction.html template. Let's go to that template now, and you can see the header that's being added here. That's why we had a duplicated header. So that's going to be there, but importantly, we're going to have a form, and that form contains the fields for adding a transaction. But when we return it this time, the form is already populated with data, and that's data from the original post request that contained a validation error. So let's now see this in action. We're going to go back to our form here, and in fact, let's go back to the list page. And what I'm going to do is go to this page here. We're going to add another type here of income with an amount of -5. And let's select a date and a category, and now we're going to click add. Now you can see that this time we get back the form that contains the data, but we don't see the validation errors. So in order to fix that, what we're going to do is go back to the create transaction.html template. At the moment we're rendering out each field with its label, but we don't have any code that's going to show any errors that are attached to these fields. So what we're going to do is we're going to find the amount field, and that's the form.amount. What we're going to do below that is add a template for loop in Django, and we're going to look at each error in form.amount.errors. And don't forget to end the template for loop below here. So basically form.amount, that's the field on the form, and .errors is going to contain an error list of any errors that are attached to that field. Now there might not be any errors, in which case this for loop will not really run. But in the case where there are errors, what we're going to do is add a paragraph tag, and I'm going to give this a class of text red 400 from Tailwind CSS. So that's text red 400, and let's also give it some margin top to separate it from the field that we have above here. And within the paragraph tag, we can render out the text for the error. And don't forget to close that paragraph tag. So basically, for each error in the errors associated with the amount field, we're going to render out a paragraph tag, and the text color is going to be red, which indicates a problem to the user. So let's now save this, and what I'm going to do is go back to the page here. Again, we'll go to my transactions, and we're going to go back to this form, and I'm going to add the same data here. So -5, let's select a date and a category. And this time, when we submit the form, you can see we now have the actual error appearing on the page. So the validation error that we had, and that's the text amount must be a positive number, that was added on the Django form class in the clean amount function. So the clean amount method here, we raised a forms.validation error whenever amount was less than or equal to 0. And in the view, we are now adding that form containing the error to the context in this else block. So that's why we now see the error here after adding this code to the HTML. So that's now working as expected. Now I want to address a small problem. If we go back to the page, this is the problem of this duplicated header. And the reason for that is because the partial that we're returning contains another header1 tag. So the returned partial contains this header1. When we submit the form, we have the hx post attribute from HTMX. And what that's going to do is it's going to send the post request, and we're going to get back this entire create transaction partial, and it's going to swap that and replace the existing form. So by default in HTMX, if you don't specify an hx target attribute, the response is going to come back in that case, and it's going to replace the element that triggered the request. And that means that the form is going to be replaced here. If we go back to the page, and let's go back to this page without the duplicated header, what's going to happen here is that we send the request and we get back that partial containing the same header here, and it's only the form on this page that's going to be replaced. So in order to solve this and prevent the duplicated header, what we're going to do is go back to VS Code, and when we have an error, we want to change the hx_target attribute, and we want to replace the entire transaction block on that page. Now the transaction block is in the transaction list.html file, so let's load that up. And you can see that here, it's within the content block, and the transaction block has this ID, and that belongs to a div element that we have here. So what we want to do is we want to return that partial and replace all of the content within this div. So let's go back to create transaction, and we're going to not set an hx_target directly. What we're going to do is use Django HTMX in order to retarget this response when the form contains an error, and only when there's an error. So what we can do in order to do that is go back to views.py, and I'm going to scroll to the top here. And what I'm going to do is bring in an import from Django HTMX. That's a package we installed earlier in the series, and that contains a .http module. We're going to import the retarget function from that, and I'm going to copy the name of that function and go back down to the create transaction view. Now in the else block, what we're doing is returning the form, and we want to change the target of this response. So what I'm going to do to start with, instead of returning the result of the render function, we're going to store that in a variable called response, and then we can return the retarget function from Django HTMX. That takes the response as the first argument, and the second argument is going to be the new target of this response. So it's going to be transaction-block, and what that's going to do behind the scenes is it's going to add a new header to the response, and that header, when HTMX receives the response, it's going to tell HTMX that we have a new target for this returned hypermedia content. Now we only want to do this when there's an error, so we're only applying this new target in the else block. Now if you want to know more about Django HTMX, we did a long video on that topic that dives into the package, so check that out. It should be appearing on the screen now. Once we've done that, we can now check if this has resolved our issue. So what I'm going to do is go back to this page by clicking this icon, and we're going to add another transaction here, and we're going to select -5 as the amount, so that's now an invalid amount. When we click add, you can see we get back the validation error, but we're no longer getting back the duplicated header. Now we can actually inspect this. I'm going to go to the browser console here, and we're going to go to the network tab. What I'm going to do is click the add button on the left hand side, and you can see the request that was sent here, and that was an AJAX request. But what I'm going to do is look at the response headers. So the response headers are here, and there is a header here called hx_retarget, and that's been added automatically by the Django HTMX package. And the value of that header is going to tell HTMX what the target for the response should be. I want to add one final thing to this form page before we move on. Let's say that the user gets to this page, but they actually don't want to add a new transaction. I want to add a cancel button at the bottom next to this add button, and that cancel button should again use HTMX in order to navigate back to the transaction list page. This is going to be very simple, so let's go back to the create transaction template. At the bottom we have the button that allows the user to actually add a new transaction. What I'm going to do is copy this button, and I'm going to bring it down below here. So we have another button, and I'm going to add text of cancel here, and let's change the color. We're going to use button error. And again, that comes from 𝗿𝗍 UI. And when this button is clicked, we're going to use HTMX to send a GET request. And that's going to go to the transaction-list URL. And again, we want to add an hx_target here and set that to that transaction block. So when the transaction list content comes back, again, it's going to replace the entire block on the page. Let's now save this and go back to the create transaction template. When we go back here, we should now see a new button, and I'm actually getting an error because this should be transactions list. So let's change the name of that and refresh the page. When we click the button, we now get taken to the form, and this time if we press cancel, we're going to send that HTMX request, and that's going to return the content for this list page. So we're building up this interactive application that allows us to navigate as if it were a single page application. Now, one thing to note in the URL is that we have still got transactions/create here. What I'm going to do is go back to the template, and we're going to add one more HTMX attribute to this cancel button. So what I'm going to add here is hx-push-URL, if I can spell that correctly. What we're going to do when the user clicks this button is navigate back to the list page, and the URL for that page was /transactions. So let's now save that, and we're going to go back to this page here. So let's focus on the URL. When we click this button here, we have transactions/create, but when we click the cancel button, we're taken back to the original URL. Let's now move on. What we're going to do is we're going to write some tests for this add transaction functionality. Now to start with, I want to create a couple of new pytest fixtures here. So let's go back to VS Code, and what we're going to do is go to the tests directory, and let's go to conftest.py. Now in the last video, what we did was we created two pytest fixtures. One was called transactions, and that created a batch of 20 transactions, and the other one was called user transactions. And that was very similar, except it created 20 transactions that were all tied to the same test user. What I want to do now is create a single fixture for creating a new user. So let's start with that one. We're going to decorate this function with pytest.fixture. And the name of this fixture is going to be called user. And it's going to return a user factory instance. That's going to create a new user object and return that. So that's a very simple fixture. When we add that to a pytest function, it's going to inject that user into the function. Now we want to add one more pytest fixture, and I'm going to paste this function in here. So it's called transaction dict parameters. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a transaction that's tied to the user, and it's injecting that user fixture above here. And this is actually a pattern in pytest. You can create a fixture, and then you can build up additional fixtures that inject the original one as a parameter. So what we're doing is we're creating a user using the first one, and then we are injecting that user into the second fixture. We're creating a transaction that's tied to the user, and then we're returning a dictionary of transaction data. So the transaction has a type, and that could be income or expense. It has a category ID, and the transaction also has a date, an amount, and I've got description here. I think that was from an earlier version of this. I'm going to remove that. And this is all we need if we want to create a transaction from a dictionary. So now that we have this, we're going to test the post request to create a new transaction. So if we go to urls.py, we have this particular URL, and it maps to that view here called create transaction. And that's this one here that we've been working on in the last two videos. We're going to test the functionality when we send this post request to make sure that when everything is okay, it creates a new transaction in the database. And we're also going to test what happens when we have some kind of validation error. So let's now go back to conftest.py. I'm going to copy the name of this transaction dictionary parameters fixture, and we're going to go back to testviews.py, and I'm going to scroll to the bottom here. Now let's write a new test here using pytest, and we're going to call this function test add transaction request, and we're going to inject some of these pytest fixtures. First of all, that user fixture, that's going to inject a single user into this function, and we're also going to pass in transaction dict parameters. And that's the one that returned that dictionary of data. And finally, we want to get access to the pytest Django client. That's going to allow us to send requests to our application. Now, what I'm also going to do is copy this pytest mark, because this test will need access to the database. So this mark from pytest Django is going to basically tell the test that we can access the database, and it's going to allow us to do that. We're also going to log in the user that's going to send this request. We can do that by using the pytest Django client's force login function. And we're going to start writing the code now. So let's start with a count of existing transactions. So user transaction count, that's going to be equal to transaction.objects.filter. So we're going to filter the transaction only down to those that belong to this user. And once we have that, we can then call .count to get back the number of transactions. Now we need to import the transaction model. So I'm going to go to the top here, and from tracker.models, we can add the transaction model to that. And I'm also going to add another import here from pytest Django.asserts. We're going to import the assert template used function from pytest Django. Now, as the name implies, this function is going to assert that a particular template was returned and used, and this mimics the behavior of the same named function or method on the Django test case class. pytest Django actually brings all of those custom Django test case assertions over to the pytest framework, so you can use them, and we're going to do that in a second. So let's go back here. We have a user transaction count. We're going to now test adding a transaction, and what we want to verify is that this count is going to increase or increment by 1. So now that we have the count, we're going to send a request with this transaction data, and that's defined in that fixture that we created. So let's do that now, but we need to attach some headers here because this is expecting an HTMX request. So I'm going to add a header here called http_hx-request, and we're going to set that to the string true. We can then create a response variable, and we're going to call client.post, and that's going to send a post request to the server. I'm going to use Django's reverse function, and we're going to reverse the create transaction URL. That's going to send the request to that URL, and we're going to add as the body the transaction dictionary parameters. And finally, we can unpack the headers here and add them to client.post. So that's going to send that post request to create a new transaction with the data specified in this dictionary. And it's also going to add this HTTP header, and that's for the integration with HTMX. What we can do after we've sent that request is we can assert that the count has increased after the post request. So what we can do is we can create another assertion here, and I'm going to call the same function actually that we defined up here. So that's transaction.objects.filter, and again we're filtering to the user's transactions. That should be equal to what we had before plus 1. So we're going to make sure that that's equal to user transaction count plus 1. And we can also use the assert template used function. And what template should be used here? So if we go back to views.py, when we have a correct transaction being added, this is the template partial that should be used in the response in that case. So let's go back to test views, and we're going to pass the name of that template into this function. And we also need to pass the response actually as a first parameter. So we're asserting that this response contains or uses this template. So let's stop the server at the bottom, and we can run the pytest command, and we're going to see if this works. So it's collected 9 tests, and you can see that all of those are passing. Now I want to just test whether this is going to work without the headers that we've got here. So I'm going to comment these out, and if we go back to the terminal and rerun the pytest command, let's see if that still works. And it does still work, so even if you don't include this HTMX header, this should still work hopefully on your system. If you have any tips on testing with HTMX, add them to the comments. It'd be interesting to know how you're testing an HTMX application. Let's now just uncomment these, and we're going to move on. I'm going to write one more test in this particular video, and we want to test this functionality. We want to make sure that the user cannot add a transaction that contains a negative amount. So let's go back to testviews.py, and what I'm going to do is copy all of this to start with, because the code is actually going to be pretty similar. So again, we have a function, and I'm going to change the name of the function. Instead of this, it's going to be called test cannot add transaction with negative amount. And I'm going to break the parameters into new lines just so that we can read that a little bit better, but we have the same fixtures that we had before injected into this pytest function. And then we're going to log the user in, and we're going to get a count of the transactions that are occurring. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take these transaction dictionary parameters, and we're going to change the value for the amount. Now if we go to the fixture itself, this is what's returned from that particular fixture, and the amount is just the number attached to that transaction. So we're going to change the value in the dictionary for the amount, and we're going to set it to -44. Once we've done that, we can copy this function at the top here, and we can get rid of the headers, I think. So what I'm going to do is remove that. So again, we're going to send a client.post request, and we're sending that to the create transaction endpoint, and we're sending these dictionary parameters. But now we've changed one of them. We've changed the amount so that it's now -44, and that should now fail the validation check that we have in the clean amount method on the form class. So what we want to do in that case is we want to assert that the count that we have here is the same as it was before we sent the post request. So that post request should not increment the number of transactions that are associated with the user. So what I'm going to do is copy the statement here, transaction.objects.filter. We're going to assert that this is still equal to the user transaction count. Now we can actually test different aspects of this response. Now, when the transaction was successfully added, we returned that partial of transaction success, but it should be a different HTML template partial when we have this error. So what I'm going to do is use the same function, assert template used, but instead of transaction success, we should actually get back the create transaction partial, and that's because this is what's returned in the else block if form.isValid returns false. So let's change the template that we're expecting back when we have an error to createTransaction.html. And what we can also do is we can check if a particular header is in the response. Now remember, the Django HTMX package, when you use retarget, it's going to add that hx retarget header and set it to this ID here. We can check that that's in the response headers. So let's go back to the test, and I'm going to use the assertion here that hx-retarget is in response.headers. So when you're using HTMX like this, you can add these kind of tests to make sure that your application is in the state that it expects to be in when you have these kind of validation errors. Let's now go back down to the terminal here. I'm going to clear this and rerun the pytest command. We should now gather 10 tests, and you can see that they're all passing now. So these assertions that were added here for the template, for the response headers, and also this assertion to make sure that the user transaction is not added when we have an invalid amount, these are all passing, and that gives us that confidence in the behavior of our system. And that can be important because when you're using HTMX, it's a different paradigm, but essentially it doesn't even matter what kind of front-end client-side technologies you're using. If you're using Django, these are the kind of tests that you want to make sure you write to make sure that the application is in a consistent state and it's behaving as you expect. And that's all for this video. We've added some validation logic, and we've also added some errors to the form. And these are going to be displayed if we submit the form with HTMX when it contains invalid values. We also saw how to use the retarget function from Django HTMX. And finally, we wrote some tests to test this new logic that we've added to the application. In the next video, we're going to go back to this transaction list page, and we're going to give users the ability to update an existing transaction or delete a transaction from the database. So that's coming in the next video. Thank you for watching this one. Don't forget to subscribe if you've not already done so, and we'll see you in the next video.